Dilemma. Today, a Russia expert tells us what we need to know about Russia under Vladimir Putin and how his leadership affects U.S.-Russia ties. Tune in to listen to Mark Pomar, Senior National Security Fellow at the Clements Center and the former CEO and President of the U.S.-Russia Foundation.
Thanks very much, Will. I realize that you are all here to hear about Russia, not necessarily me, but I will try to convey as much as I can about, I think, a very interesting and very important topic, which of course is not just Russia, but U.S. policy toward Russia. And I thought I would start by telling you three stories from the past to set kind of a framework for today's discussion. And I learned recently, Will, that the tradition of the Clements Center is to give historical context. And so I will, in that tradition, try to give a certain historical context to what is a very problematic and important relationship or non-relationship today. I would like to begin by taking you back to 1982, back to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, where I was assistant director of the Russian service. And this was sort of the beginning of Reagan policy toward the Soviet Union in the area of we're fighting communism, we're supporting Russian people, we're going to defeat communism, and that's going to bring on a very different world situation, a very different relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I remember very distinctly sitting in the downstairs basement canteen of Radio Free Europe, where all important things took place. And I was having lunch with a group of recent emigres. These were Jewish refuseniks, dissidents. One person in the group had spent 10 years in the Gulag. And I was telling them, as someone very young and enthusiastic, about the Reagan approach. We're going to defeat communism. Radio Liberty is going to put on programs about Russian history, Russian culture, that Russians, and this is a very important point, that Russians were as much victims of communism as were Poles or Czechs or Hungarians, very much embedded in sort of the whole Reagan notion of we're going to defeat communism and bring about change. And I realized very quickly that I was getting nowhere with this group. I mean, this group sort of looked at me and sort of, finally one guy said, look, he said, you know, you Americans mean well, you try to do the right thing, but you don't understand Russia. He said, communism is dying. No one's going to go out in '82 and fight and die for communism. But Russian nationalism, Russian interest, imperialism is very much alive. And if that melds with Soviet practice, you guys are going to be in greater trouble than you could ever imagine. 1982, basement of Radio Liberty. I have to admit, I took it with a grain of salt. I thought, well, yeah, maybe, but you know, these guys have their grievances. Maybe that's not the case. But I remembered it. The feeling with which they expressed it was so convincing. That's story number one. Story number two, we go 10 years forward, 1992. And then I was at the Board for National Broadcasting, which oversaw Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. We also dealt with Voice of America and broadcasting issues. And I was in Moscow triumphantly, a great moment in American policy. Soviet Union had fallen. We were, this is the last year of the Bush administration, we were setting up Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty offices. We were negotiating transmission of broadcasts within Russia. Things were going well. This was a very, very kind of heady time for those of us involved in U.S.-Russia relations. And again, things were going well. And this one person in the group said, hey, come down, let's have a cup of coffee, and I want to talk to you. And from this very triumphant moment that we had in this meeting, we went downstairs, had a cup of coffee, and he told me, look, he says, you Americans don't really get it. You just don't. Right now, and I remember it so well as if it were yesterday, he says, right now, we're in trouble. We need your help, and we will do anything and everything to get that help. But when we get off our knees, and when we are strong again, we're going to throw you bastards out of here so quickly that you won't know what happened to you. And we'll never say thank you. And it was said with such anger and such forcefulness. that I obviously remembered it, but I also thought at the time, dinosaur, someone who's sort of back in some other period. This was so overwhelmingly kind of positive in so many ways, what we were doing. We were setting up offices, organizations. USAID was going to start up. We had just passed the Freedom Support Act. Millions of dollars were going in. Russians were very, very appreciative. And I participated in the 90s in a lot of the programs, setting up the first internet access site in Russia, doing scholarships, training programs, and on and on and on. But I remembered this guy because he said with such force that this is not something that's going to last. This is not Russia. And then, just to sort of add to the story, I was invited in 1995-96 to be on a radio talk show explaining American programs that we were implementing, the sort of Freedom Support Act programs in Russia. And this was on a very liberal station, Echo of Moscow, for those of you who may know it. And we talked about Muskie fellowships, undergraduate fellowships, high school programs, all the things that had been taking place in Russia at that time. And then the MC turned it over and said, well, let's get some calls from listeners. And what we heard was absolute hate calls, basically saying, get the hell out of Russia. Don't deal with our youth. You are perverting our country. You don't belong here. And I was just stunned walking out. We were both stunned. Actually, the person who had led the discussion was astounded and very embarrassed by the amount of sheer disgust with American presence in Russia in the mid-90s when we thought things were just going swimmingly. Third story. Will mentioned that I started the U.S.-Russia Foundation. It's a very interesting kind of part of U.S. policy toward Eastern Europe, toward the Soviet Union, toward Russia. Back in the 90s, USAID, Hill obviously passed it, set up what were called enterprise funds that would invest money into the economies of Russia, Poland, Czech Republic, Bulgaria, and so on and so forth. Large sums of money. The idea being that if these funds are successful, and they invested in commercial projects, part of that, half of that, would become a foundation in perpetuity. And the idea being that this would be a partnership, that the United States would reach out and form lasting partnerships with these countries. Large sums of money went in. The Russia Foundation, the Russia Enterprise Fund got $320 million to invest. $320 million. And it invested, it lost, it gained, it lost. Finally, in 2005, the idea was Poland had set up a foundation, other countries had set up foundations. The idea was that in 2005, we would start setting up the Russia Foundation. And President Bush raised this with Mr. Putin in 2005, said, this is the time for partnership. Let's start it up. I actually checked with Steve Hadley, who sat in on that meeting, what Mr. Putin's reaction was. And Steve Hadley told me it was hard to read, but it wasn't negative. He basically nodded and said, yeah, okay. The Americans took that as a very positive response, and we went ahead and set up the foundation in 2008, and my wife and son and I moved to Russia to run it. Initially, knowing kind of the history and being involved in Russia, I knew one very important thing. To get it right, we have to have Russian buy-in. We have to have Russians putting money on the table and saying this is also ours. Otherwise, we're going to run into the problems that I had seen earlier. Well, initially it went well. And in a sense, the Bush-Obama foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia was very similar in mine, certainly what part I was involved in. And it initially went quite well. I mean, some of the points where we had programs going, we had Russian organizations, we worked with the Russian Commercial Court, we worked with Russian universities. I had breakfast with the Minister of Education, Mr. Fursenko, who told me over breakfast, this is exactly, you finally got it right. You finally understood after all these years that we don't want handouts, we want partnership. We will put in money, you put in money. I told that to John Byerly, who was then ambassador to Russia, and he thought, perfect, we finally figured this out. You know, we were doing this wrong, that wrong. We finally kind of got it the right mix. Well, up until a point. Come 2012, return of Putin, everything went downhill. Our programs had not changed, the approach had not changed, the reset continued, and all of a sudden, what we were doing went from being good to being bad. Putin went to one of his speeches. He said, American organizations are scurrying around Russian universities, finding the most talented students, taking them to the United States, brainwashing them, and bringing them back as agents of America. Once he said that, our applications dried up. Went from 200 a quarter to 5 or 6. A completely different Russia reappeared. And all the good things that we have been doing, the idea of integrating Russia through economic development, through partnership, through entrepreneurship, part of our program was to develop and encourage entrepreneurship. That went by the wayside. And so what do these 3 stories basically tell you? First of all, it's very difficult to get it right. Russia, and this is my fervent belief and based on 40 years of dealing with it, is a different country, and it's not just like any other. And there's a tendency among well-meaning American policymakers of basically making Russia, well, it worked here, it will work in Russia. It was a fine program, you name the country, we can import it to Russia. Maybe the most blatant example of that was a dinner conversation I had with a USAID director, probably in the early 2000s, who was telling me with great enthusiasm what a great textbook program AID had done in whatever African country. Wouldn't it be great to do it in Russia? I thought to myself, you are crazy. You are nuts. Russia would no more have a foreign country preparing its textbook than probably the state of Texas would. I mean, it is, certain things just cannot be in that culture, in that country. And so part of the problem with American policy has always been a kind of another country. It is like whatever your last experience was. So if you're going to build a relationship, build a strategy, you've got to build with the fact that I think it's going to be a very unique one, different from any other. What are the things that I kind of learned from all these years of experience? I would start doing a strategy with a list of what not to do first. I would not build it on a personal relationship leader to leader. That's very popular in American policy to do. Bush had it with, or wanted to have it with Putin. Obama developed it or wanted to develop it with Medvedev, which was the wrong one to develop it with. That went very badly. Reagan had it with Gorbachev. Obviously, it's good PR, it's good media, but I don't think that's how you build a relationship. And I think Russians are very, very shrewd in playing along, but knowing that national interests come first. I would certainly drop the we want to help you approach, which was the AID approach. We're there to help you. We're there to make you better. Plays very badly. I mean, look at the experience of George Soros. George Soros did so much good for Russia. Paid salaries, paid scientists to do good work, developed scholarships, and he is hated in Russia. I think very unfairly, but that's the case. They don't like it, they don't want it, they don't understand it, and they think there's something evil behind it. In other words, if you're doing it for some nefarious reason. Another one that is hard for Americans to accept is that Russians don't understand win-win. Every American goes in, it's a win-win situation. We gain, you gain. We gain. Russians think if you gain, they lose. If they gain, you lose. That's it. And I've never, ever, ever come across any Russian official, or any Russian, frankly, who understands, appreciates the whole notion of win-win. It's a very commercial, transactional notion. It's a commercial society that looks at win-win. Russia is not a commercial society. I may add parenthetically that this morning I read a piece by Mr. Surkov, and those of you who follow Russian politics may know who he is. He's been sort of touted as Putin's ideologist. He's the one who created that term or invented the term managed democracy or sovereign democracy. Anyway, he has a very, very controversial article, long article he just published yesterday in a major publication, in which he very, very frankly says that, the United States is this whole win-win, this whole notion of working together is just false. It's not true. It's not at all in our culture, not at all in our approach to life. And finally, and this is really what he makes a big point of, Russia is not a commercially oriented country. I remember having a discussion with one of my board members at US-Russia Foundation who couldn't understand why would Russians cut off something that brings money into the country. And I said, because ideology is far more important than money. Far more important. It's more important to get it right in terms of their conception of what is important than whether extra money comes in and people get it or not. That's not bad. There's nothing wrong with getting extra money, but that does not override whatever the ideological focus happens to be. So what are the assumptions of Russia today? Now, I have a checklist which we could discuss, and just to kind of give you a sense of where it is. And I would say, just to start, that Russia is, has been, and probably will be, what is generally termed a police state. Polizeistaat in German, if you want to go back to its origins in Germany. In other words, it's not a rule of law state. It's not a state, the prosecutor is more important than the judge. The prosecutor wins 99 point whatever percent of every case. That's the way it is. And I was delighted to see that Mr. Surkov, in his article this morning, precisely, he used police/military state. He says we're a police/military state. The way we were, the way we will be. I went, in thinking of policy, I went back and reread George Kennan. And I would highly recommend any of you to do that. Because a lot of what he says in the long telegram really has pertinence today. Basically, there are national interests, there's an ideology, there is an apprehensive view of the West, and basically, as Kennan says, they understand the logic of force. If they feel that they have bumped into something that is going to be problematic, they'll step back. If not, they'll go forward. I think that Kennan's view of Russia, frankly, is not a bad place to look at strategy and relationships. Is Russia a friend or a foe? For the longest time, in the 90s and early 2000s, we sort of treated Russia as kind of a friend of sorts. For their domestic reasons, Russia does not want to be a friend. It's not that the United States doesn't want to be a friend, Russia does not want to be a friend. And this is something we could discuss in greater length, but basically for their political purposes, it is convenient and important to have the United States as an adversary or an enemy. It unites the country, it makes them feel very important. They have an important enemy, important adversary. It requires them to be much more cohesive and sort of together. And another point I would say that Russia has an exceptional quality to it. Basically sees itself as something that is not, as I said earlier, just any country. It is indeed something special, something unique. It has its own role. Those of you who've studied Russian history or read Russian literature, if you've read Dostoevsky, that's basically what Dostoevsky talks about, the messianic role of Russian culture, the messianic role of the Russian experience. That's very much back today, and one that I think has a lot of resonance with people in the country. Last couple of weeks ago, we had a very important Russian historian on campus here at UT, Steve Kotkin. And he made a statement which I think is really worth pondering and remembering. And it's one of the best little summations of Russia that I could give you. So I give him full credit for this. He said, Russia is a European country, but it is not Western. Japan, in contrast, is a Western country, but not European. And I think in that very succinct statement, he really captured a lot of the problems that we have in dealing with Russia. There is this natural assumption that because Russian literature, Russian music, Russian art, Russian culture, Russian scholarship is so interwoven with Europe, that beginning in the 18th century, Russians learned and spoke foreign languages. French and German had a very important influence, English today, that somehow Russians are Europeans. They are and they are not. And if you go back into Russian history, you go back into Russian philosophy, you will see that anti-Westernism is as much embedded in their conception of who they are as anything that is, quote, European. Again, a topic that could be discussed at great length, but I think one that is really important for any kind of comprehension of Russia. Whatever you read in the press about it, keep that in mind. That is, partly it's European, but it's not fully European. Another thing that you see in Russia, and we lived there for 7, 8 years, is the nostalgia for empire, for greatness, for this sense of we were great, and now look at us. You know, the Soviet Union was feared. The Soviet Union was known. That gave people, even people who really didn't have much of anything personally, gave them a sense of importance, a sense of place, a sense of pride. We lost it. They want it back. Now, they can't get it back quite the same way. As a matter of fact, even this article that I've mentioned, Surkov talks about we fell from the heights of the Soviet Union to the low point of the Russian Federation. That's the term he uses. We've fallen. We need to. And one way to do that is to be aggressive, to be forceful, to force your way on. So you go into Syria, you support Venezuela, you get involved in negotiations in the Middle East, you assert your place, and if it has to be a place of a troublemaker, well, so be it. I mean, that's a way of being important. Much better that than ignored. This goes back a few years ago, but I remember this one Russian, fairly well connected to the Kremlin, told me. What really irritates them about the United States is that he said, we consider the United States the number one concern. You put us number 7 or number 8. And that was upsetting. We want to be number 1, not number 7, not Middle East, not Iran, we want to be number 1 on your agenda. And in a sense, they've become that. And they sort of forced their way into being a major figure. So, having kind of looked at these basic points, what should a U.S.-Russia strategy look like? I sort of sketched out 5 points, and we can discuss them and debate them if you wish, and maybe add a few more if you think that's relevant. But if I were sitting in the White House or the State Department and I had this assignment, I would probably start with containment, back to George Kennan's very, very famous sort of approach. Contain what you can. In other words, there's aggressive behavior, there's Ukraine, there's Georgia, there's Baltic states, Middle East, Venezuela. Where you can, contain Russian incursion. And I think Georgia, Ukraine, and Baltic states are probably the most. But there's also Central Asia, where they're influencing. At least preserve what has transpired in terms of separate countries. Confront. I'm not any expert on cyber warfare, but I think, if anything, Russia needs to be confronted. How and what ways, I don't know, but that should be high on anyone's list in terms of how to deal with it. One thing that I think we're not doing as a country at all is we're not, and this would be the third point, challenge. We're not challenging the Russian version of what happens. There is a Russian narrative of the 90s that's simply not true, and we don't challenge it. They have painted the 90s, very critical decade, one that really, really needs to be studied, because in the 1990s, all of these things floated up. The negative approach, the things that I heard from this guy back in 92, these things were there, and they kind of gained currency, and they became important. There's a narrative that the Russians present of democracy, of the United States, of Western health, that is blatantly and absolutely not true. And I say that because I was part of it. I mean, I was involved in these programs. I did the programs. I interacted with these people. And it's just not at all the case. They paint it as US exploitation of Russia. They paint it as US imposing, its values, stealing money, whatever else. Meanwhile, we, of course, brought in lots and lots. I'm not saying there weren't problems and people didn't make mistakes, but it's a fundamental approach. The whole notion of the Freedom Support Act and the programs that came out of it were really a glorious, I think, period in American foreign policy. Not a bad one. They've painted it and people buy into it. There's no challenge to that narrative. There's no counter to that. Now, it's not an easy thing to counter, but there are means, there's social media, there are broadcasts, there are ways in which we could be creative in terms of challenging that view. And I think unless that view is somehow challenged, the United States is painted in so black a light that it's very, very easy to add to it every anti-American story they could possibly add. Speaking of which, I don't know how many of you ever watch Russian media in any way. Those of you who know Russian may do that. I think if Americans watch a Sunday night news wrap-up in Russian about what is said, they would be in shock. And it's not just criticism of government. It is a deep, day in, day out criticism. I mean, it got so bad when we were living in Russia, we just turned off the TV. You just can't take it after a while. Even though I knew it was my job to watch it and to understand it, but there's a limit to that as well. So I would say challenge, which we're not doing at all. Engage. It's not easy, but Russia is not the Soviet Union. Soviet Union, and I spent time there. I was a Fulbrighter in the Soviet Union. I went to the Soviet Union for the first time in 1973. It's a different country. They tried to block everything. Everything had to go through the government. Russia's not that. It's porous in ways that the Soviet Union was not. There are ways in which conferences, meetings, joint projects, there are ways in which to engage. And by engaging, of course, I mean breaking down the stereotypes that are being presented about both the United States, about democracy, about the West, about sort of the state of the world. I mean, this is a small example, but one that might resonate with the academic community here. But there was an organization called American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, started 60 years ago, which was an American/European organization studying that part of the world. Until 1989 or 1990, no Soviet would ever be able to attend. That organization has been rechristened to sort of involve Eurasia. And what amazes me is that in today's conferences, Russian scholars take a very leading role. And they come and they are encouraged. And there's a whole area of discussion that would have been impossible in the Soviet Union that's certainly possible today. And it's a tiny, tiny example of engagement, but one that would obviously could resonate. There are very interesting departments of American studies in Russia, which would be very interesting for American historians to be engaged in. So there are places to engage. Not a lot. I'm not saying this will turn the world around, but there obviously are ways in which to look at it. And finally, there is that area that everybody puts as issues that should be discussed: space, communicable disease, pollution, climate control, and so forth. Areas where terrorism, of course, areas where Russian and American interests on a certain high level can find common ground. That's been the case even with the Soviet Union, certainly the case with Russia today, but I don't think those fundamentally change or fundamentally create an overall good relationship. So if you kind of look back, I mean, I look back at my own life, I can tell you the policy under Reagan, I can tell you the policy under Bush, I can tell you the policy under Clinton, under Bush Jr., and under Obama. I have no idea what to say about today. So I leave that for you to give me your thoughts. I do not see a strategy, a policy, an attempt. I would say, though, that there are certain things that probably are worth kind of keeping in mind. I think the notion of changing Russia is probably not a very good way to go. If you look at, again, Reagan and Bush and Clinton and so forth, underlying US policy toward the Soviet Union or Russia, there was a fundamental sense that we can do something to change it. That was there in Reagan, it was very explicit. We can defeat communism. I'm writing a book on the radios, and I've been doing quite a bit of research on the Reagan period, and it's absolutely crystal clear. This is what we're going to do. This is what we're going to accomplish. I think in the case of President Bush, Bob Hutchings, of course, would know this better than I, but there was a sense of we can bring them in. We can make them somehow part of this global structure, global world, new world order in one way or another, through help, through assistance, through teaching them how to be a capitalist country. And that was a big part of our policy. I was involved in a small aspect of it called teaching Russians what independent media was. They had no independent media. And there were programs funded by USAID that were intended to help start radio stations, newspapers, how you do ads, how you calculate listenership, how you calculate sales, how you market. This was a big part of what the US community did. It did it through government funds, it did it through commercial funds, but that was part of it. So there was a sense of change, that we were going to change it. Under Clinton, that became even bigger. That was sort of massive, big amounts of money going in different areas. So that change, less so under, obviously, Bush, second Bush, and under Obama, because by then Russia was pushing back. But even there, when I was there, people talked about, finally Russia is in the WTO. That means we are going to be trading more. There's going to be more involvement. We need to set up. We need to have joint it was very economically oriented. But the underlying point was change. We will bring about this change. What Putin has done is basically said, we don't want it. Close the door. We know what we want to do. We don't want anything imported. We have our own historical traditions. We will follow what we consider to be our, and we'll keep you at bay. So whatever policy we come up with, that kind of approach would not work. And if you think of our approach after World War II, it too was predicated on change. I mean, maybe détente was probably the one period where there was a sort of coexistence that you do your thing, we'll do our thing. But even then, there were still endless amounts of hopes and so forth that we would somehow, the Helsinki process was one of change. And so whether or not it makes sense to push that, probably doesn't. I can't help but go back to the stories that I started with. In retrospect, the Jewish refuseniks and the dissidents had it right. I mean, what they told me in '82 is essentially what we have today. we have a Soviet state, Soviet practice, Soviet technique, merged with a nationalist, Orthodox-inspired Russia that is pushing. And what happens here, and this is the thing that is most, is that people right now, I believe, my sense is, really buy into it. In other words, the American approach to Russia is it's a kleptocracy. They want to stay in power. They want to stay where they are. Perfectly fine, probably is 100% true. But to do that, they very effectively tapped in to a latent nationalism and national greatness that helps them maintain that sort of position in the country. So I think that the dissidents had it right. I'm very impressed by their prescience. But even the person who spoke to me in 1992, and that is that amazing resentment toward the West coming in. And I think we underestimated as a country what that meant. Think of America sending Peace Corps to Russia. I mean, the United States sent Peace Corps to Russia. I mean, Russians who talked to me thought it was the greatest insult they had ever experienced. I mean, this is a country that was first in space, and we're sending them Peace Corps. I mean, this was seen as, did more to alienate a lot of Russians, the very fact that the United States would think that they needed Peace Corps. Now, mind you, Peace Corps did very well in Central Asia. It's still there today, as I understand. So it's the misreading of Russia versus the other republics, which, of course, carried with it a lot of problems.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.